Okay, today we are taking a look at an absolutely crazy game that was played in the 2023 German Masters, round 7, between Grandmaster Dennis Wagner and International Master Christopher No. Honestly, this is one of the craziest games I've seen all year. The time control is 90 minutes for 40 moves, followed by 30 minutes for the rest of the game. And we also have a 30-second increment from move 1. So we are talking proper classical chess time controls, but the way that the game plays out, you might have mistaken this game for a blitz or a bullet game. Okay, so let's dive straight into the game. We start off with d4, d5, c4, and we have the Queen's Gambit Accepted. Knight f3, knight f6, e3. So this is a fairly quiet approach from white. There are a lot more aggressive approaches that white can take in the Queen's Gambit Accepted, but what we'll see is that the game becomes anything but quiet and stable. e6, we recapture on c4, a6, castles, and black strikes with a very fast c5. Now, in this position here, what is typical is for white to recapture immediately in the center, or to drop the bishop back to b3. White plays bishop e2, which is a fairly rare move and might have caught black somewhat unaware. We have knight d7, simply developing. We see knight d2, developing his knight. You might think, well, shouldn't the knight go on c3? Isn't that a more active square? But his idea here is that he'd like to actually play b3 and bishop b2, getting his bishop on the long diagonal. And when you have the bishop on b2, it's actually nice to have this diagonal as vacated as you possibly can. So if the knight is on c3, it's kind of getting in the bishop's way. So he places the knight on d2 instead. We have b5, black is expanding on the queen side, a4, striking at the black construction here on the queen side. It is often a good idea to try to break up these strong pawn chains as they advance. Black pushes forward with b5 and white advances with b3, a multi-purpose move here, vacating b2 for the bishop. Also clamping down on black's advance. By having b3 here, we are really limiting black's options to continue his expansion on the queen side. Bishop b7, bishop b2, we have both bishops on the long diagonals now, facing the enemy king side. Bishop e7, simply developing, getting ready to castle. Knight c4, getting active with our pieces, targeting some of the dark squares in black's camp. Castles, rook c1, rook c8, takes on c5, black recaptures. We have the queens staring each other off now. Does white want to exchange queens and play a quiet queenless middle game, or does he have some spicier ideas in mind? Knight e4, he's going for the spice. Queen c7, a5, interesting move here, advancing on the queen side and clamping down on b6. White might look to establish a knight on b6 where it would control some pretty key light squares in black's camp. Rook d8, so black is lining his rook up against the white queen. And in this position here, with the rook lined up against the queen, he is threatening e6, e5, which would trap the knight. White has to do something about that. He simply steps the queen out of that pin, and notice that the b4 pawn is under attack now. Black defends b4 by centralizing his knight, and have a look at these ponies here. How often do you see a cube of knights like this? Very funky. f4 from white. Very, very provocative. He is looking to launch a pawn storm and clamp down on some squares in the center. It is a very provocative move. He is weakening e3 quite a bit, which already has some pressure on it from the knight. Yeah, let's see how this plays out. This is a very aggressive move here. Bishop f6, and white jumps in with his knight to e5, which seems aggressive on the surface of things, advancing your knight to this advanced square and towards the black king. But have a look at this. That knight on c4 was playing some pretty important defensive duties. It was defending the pawn on e3, and it was also defending the pawn on a5 as well. So from c4, it was playing some pretty important defensive duties. So we now have two pawns that are hanging. What on earth is going on in this position? Can't black just simply take on e3? You're hitting the rook? What could be possibly wrong with that? The idea for white is that in case black took on e3, his idea was that he was going to take back on b4. So now we have a double attack on the knight, and we also have a pin along that file as well. If black were to take the rook here, we would take the knight on c5 with tempo against the queen. The queen would be forced back, and then we would recapture on f1, and this is a very dominant position for white. So black didn't take on e3, he instead played bishop takes e5, white recaptured, and he took that hanging pawn on a5 with his queen. Now this starts a sequence of some very enterprising and exciting chess. If we have a look at the king side here, we can notice that there are no pieces around black's king. No attacking pieces from white, but more importantly, no defensive pieces. There is no knight on f6, there is no bishop on g7. There's really nothing around black's king. And black has just sidelined his queen onto a5, where it would take a long time for that queen to get back into any defensive position. White pushes forward and gets his queen into a dangerous position here on h4, starting to observe that black king very closely. Black takes the pawn on e3. It is important to see that in the process of moving that knight, we have now just unlocked this absolutely monstrous bishop as well on b7. Have a look at this. We are now simultaneously attacking g2, and the knight is also hitting f1 as well. White has no choice but to step up with his rook, so saving the rook and defending g2 at the same time. We have black prancing in with his ponies. Look at these two knights on e3 and e4, an absolutely menacing configuration here. We are hitting the rook on f2, so white advances and gets out of that threat. And we have the queen now advancing and striking against the bishop on b2. Surely that bishop needs to be defended, right? It's a hanging piece. Wrong. Look at that. Rook to f7. He sacrificed the rook. The idea here is absolutely incredible. You might look at it initially and say, okay, that's straightforward. If he takes with the rook, then that leaves this guy hanging, right? So I'd be able to recapture the rook with check, and I've picked up a pawn on f7 in the process. But doesn't that mean that I can just take this rook with my king and just be up a rook? What's happening here? This is an incredible sequence actually. The simple queen to h7. We have just sacrificed the rook, and all we have got to show for it at this stage are two measly pawns. But there is an absolutely devastating attack on the way here. Bishop h5 check. The rook is coming through onto the 7th rank, and it turns out that there really isn't much that can be done to stop that. For example, if we try to bring our knight back into a defensive act, bishop to h5 check. See the king sidelines, we take here, we intercept, we come in from this side, black tries to intercept, and now we simply start gobbling things up. We can just, it is an absolute mess and a checkmate in the end as well. So absolutely incredible sequence. Black sees that as well. He sees that he can't simply just win a free rook with his king. So he acknowledges that, okay, I have to recapture with the rook and let you take back with check. Which white does, he drops back. And now the queen drops back to c7, where we have pressure here. We have pressure here as well, in case a knight finds itself on e6. So this is looking very promising for white. This looks absolutely devastating, right? There's a knight coming into e6. We're going to be threatening checkmate. If black tries to interpose his rook to challenge the queen, we'll simply give a check and pick up the bishop. So what can black do? So it turns out in this position that black is actually completely winning. And so to me, it is absolutely incredible that in this position, actually black has a winning advantage with the simple move knight g5, which protects e6, stopping that devastating attacking idea. And okay, if white simply takes this bishop, then black will take on b2. We are now hitting the knight, we are hitting the rook, We also have pressure here. So for example, you know, if the... I can't even find a good move here for white because literally everything is hanging. You have to move the rook, right? Because if you don't move the rook, it'll be recaptured with check. So let's say, for example, you do something like, I don't know, like you go here, but then we take the knight here on d4 and we've got an absolutely crushing discovered check on the way as well. So in that position, knight g5 actually was a crushing position for black. Black instead takes the bishop on b2, which is given a double question mark, because it allows that pony to jump into e6. And now we are threatening checkmate, which needs to be responded to. Black brings his knight back into a defensive position, covering g7. We threaten simply to remove that knight. If we can get rid of that knight, then we have a pretty crushing attack there. He jumps into f2. What on earth is going on here? There was a bishop that was hanging on e2. Now his own knight is hanging. The bishop is hanging on b7. What on earth is going on here? I'm sure white was scratching his head as well. So he was saying, okay, well, I'm just going to take that knight. And what do you have? He plays rook c8, attacking the queen. So his idea here is that if white moves his queen off the c-file, he's going to penetrate down and start getting activity. Okay, so what does white do about his queen? Nothing. He sacrifices the queen. He leaves his queen hanging. The idea is that if black takes the queen, we don't recapture the rook, we give checkmate. That right there is checkmate with the rook and the knight. Incredible. Queen sacrifice here. So instead of taking the queen, he tries one last desperate check. Notice that it is a double attack against the rook. He doesn't even need to protect the rook. White simply drops his bishop back to f1, leaving his rook hanging here. But in this position, black resigned, because if you take the queen, there is checkmate here. And if you take the rook, there is checkmate here. Unbelievable. So in this final position, white's queen was hanging and his rook was hanging as well. However, with all of that said, white is completely winning in this position and black resigned when he has his queen and his rook hanging. What an unbelievable game played in the German Masters 2023, round 7. Absolutely fantastic.